For years, Jake Reiner maintained a deliberate distance from public scrutiny, remaining largely silent amid the persistent attention drawn to his family. Now, according to individuals close to him, he has chosen to speak out, and his account of his father, the filmmaker Rob Reiner, and his brother Nick, is unsettling those who believed they had a clear grasp of the family's dynamics. Sources familiar with Jake's perspective emphasize that his decision to come forward stems not from a desire for retribution or publicity, but from long-simmering frustration. He contends that the narrative presented to the public has been carefully sanitized, omitting pivotal episodes and choices that Rob Reiner preferred to keep private. Unlike others in the family circle, perhaps a reference to more directly involved figures, Jake's viewpoint is described as detached, keenly observant, and notably less indulgent. Insiders say he observed from the periphery as Nick grappled repeatedly with profound difficulties, while Rob maintained that matters were firmly in hand. Jake reportedly discerned recurring patterns that others overlooked: discussions abruptly curtailed, cautions dismissed, and arrangements finalized without broader input. In his view, Rob was not merely safeguarding the family's reputation, but actively preserving a particular version of events. The timing of Jake's disclosures adds to their disquieting impact. They emerge only after the family's circumstances have irrevocably unraveled, when protective measures no longer serve any purpose. Those close to him suggest Jake has long felt that essential truths concerning Nick were suppressed well before the crisis reached its fatal conclusion, and that Rob bore greater responsibility for that suppression than has been acknowledged. This is not, in Jake's telling, a tale of isolated misjudgments. It reflects prolonged denial, subtle dominance, and the steep price of refusing to confront reality. As fragments of his perspective circulate, a central question lingers uncomfortably. What exactly did Rob Reiner understand about Nick's condition that he sought to shield from wider view, and why has Jake chosen this moment to address it? According to those acquainted with his thinking, Jake's impressions of Nick were never clouded by immediate turmoil, but formed through consistent observation over time. He did not intervene to resolve crises or paper over difficulties. Instead, he watched as familiar issues resurfaced, despite repeated assurances of progress. That very detachment, sources indicate, lends his recollections their current weight. Jake allegedly noted how any sign of Nick's stabilization prompted swift declarations of success. Expressions of worry were promptly reframed as grounds for optimism, as though articulating the depth of the struggle might somehow revive it. Rob, in particular, is said to have quashed pessimistic tones, not through confrontation, but with measured firmness. To Jake, this registered less as encouragement than as containment. When Jake posed straightforward inquiries, what is the sustained strategy? What if current measures fail? Responses were invariably nonspecific. He interpreted them not as explanations but as conversation enders. What troubled him most was not Nick's actions per se, but the family's haste in moving beyond them. Issues were contained rather than resolved, accountability deferred indefinitely. Over time, Jake grew convinced he was the outlier, unwilling to subscribe to the optimistic storyline cultivated in private. While others embraced hope, he clung to scrutiny, observing how apprehensions were diluted, deadlines adjusted, and responsibility perpetually postponed. In this light, Jake's narrative diverges markedly from the prevailing public understanding. He maintains that warning signals were not concealed, but deliberately disregarded, most consistently by the figure entrusted with the most authority, his father. By the point broader awareness dawned, Jake believes critical realities had already been submerged beneath layers of reassurance. As his perspective gains traction, it revives the very doubts he has harbored for years. Was the family truly protecting Nick, or safeguarding Rob's tightly managed version of events? Jake describes his deepest exasperation as arising not from Nick's conduct, but from the family's reluctance to name it plainly. Insiders recount his repeated efforts to initiate candid discussions, only to see them gently redirected or closed, never with hostility, but with composed authority that rendered persistence futile. Whenever specifics grew too pointed, Rob reportedly intervened to soften phrasing, diffuse urgency, and pivot toward patience and positivity. Jake perceived not resolutions but deferrals. He was frequently urged to trust the process, amid confident references to plans and structures that lacked concrete detail. An implicit family guideline emerged, he claims. Avoid statements that might signal instability. Concern was permissible, Skepticism was not. Eventually, Jake ceased raising issues, not because his concerns evaporated, but because each attempt met the same outcome: calm platitudes, evasive replies, and an unmistakable close to the matter. In retrospect, he views that silence as cultivated, gradually, courteously, but purposefully, suggesting the concealment of truths about Nick was no oversight, but a calculated outcome, achieved one restrained exchange at a time. The decisive rupture, according to Jake, came with a particular episode that permanently altered his regard for his father. He refers to a formal evaluation, documented, discussed in confidence, then quietly excised from family discourse. Sources describe it as a professional assessment linked to Nick, not casual conjecture, but a grave analysis highlighting serious concerns about stability and future risk. Jake alleges Rob reviewed it, recognized its implications, and promptly terminated further discussion, not due to inaccuracy, but because it undermined the narrative he wished to uphold. Rather than broadening consultation or inviting external perspectives, Rob allegedly opted for restriction. Information shared sparingly, the matter presented as resolved. To Jake, this transcended privacy protection. It constituted control over perceived severity. When he questioned why key individuals remained uninformed, the response, per his account, was stark. It would only exacerbate matters. That reply endures with him, emblematic of how denial, in his estimation, intensified rather than mitigated the underlying peril. From that moment, Jake Reiner says he ceased to accept the public account at face value. He came to see two distinct versions of his brother Nick, the one carefully presented to the world, and the far more troubled one that their father, Rob, labored to contain and supervise out of sight. Jake found himself caught between these realities. What he describes as the suppressed truth was not a single explosive event, but a series of documented red flags, warnings that, in his view, never reached those who might have acted on them with the necessary urgency. Once that internal dossier was effectively shelved, Jake believes the family passed an irreversible threshold. Candor gave way to containment. Outwardly, the family projected measured optimism in their communications. Inside the home, however, Jake portrays an atmosphere of chronic instability. Nick's conduct, he says, grew erratic in subtle but unmistakable ways. Not daily eruptions so much as a persistent unpredictability that wore everyone down. One day calm, the next distant, or hyper-vigilant. Conversations that began ordinarily could veer into disorientation or unfounded suspicion. Jake recalls episodes in which Nick appeared convinced of plots against him, parsing innocuous remarks for hidden intent, or overreacting to minor matters. These were not anomalies, in his telling, but a discernible pattern. What disturbed him most was the response, or lack of one. Rather than pause to confront the underlying issues, Rob reportedly insisted on maintaining structure, rigid timetables, firm boundaries, repeated assurances of improvement. To Jake, this strategy sidestepped the mounting tension rather than easing it. The household seemed organized around accommodating Nick's volatility instead of addressing its roots. Socially, too, Nick was handled with extreme caution. Topics were steered clear of, guests selectively excluded, plans abruptly altered to avert potential flashpoints. Jake saw this not as genuine progress toward stability, but as a form of managed isolation, keeping the private turmoil from spilling into public view, even as it intensified behind closed doors. That realization, he says, crystallized his disillusionment. The family's narrative was not merely polished for outsiders. Daily life revolved around evading uncomfortable realities. Open discussion of what was unfolding indoors was actively discouraged, with Rob, in Jake's estimation, the principal architect of that reticence. It is precisely this enforced silence, Jake now maintains, that compels him to speak out. The domestic reality he witnessed bore no resemblance to the reassuring updates shared more broadly. Yet Jake is unequivocal on one point. He never harbored animosity toward Nick. Affection for his brother was never in question. The difficulty lay in observing someone he loved steadily deteriorate, while those steering the response maintained that matters remained manageable. That distinction is crucial, he stresses. His grievances were never directed at Nick himself, but at the curtain of discretion drawn around him. Those familiar with Jake's perspective note that he frequently defended Nick when others grew exasperated, choosing empathy over judgment. Even as Nick's actions became harder to rationalize, Jake sought to comprehend rather than condemn. He viewed his brother as a person in profound distress, not as someone deliberately sowing disorder. Despite repeated rejections, Jake continued to reach out, to express concern, to remain present. There were occasions when Nick's detachment unnerved him, not through overt hostility, but through profound disconnection, rambling speech, fixation on incongruous ideas, a pervasive air of unreality. Still, Jake's prevailing impulse was worry, not fear. He felt Nick required greater transparency, more substantive aid, and far less artifice. What pains him deepest today is the sense that Nick became an issue to be managed rather than a person to be engaged directly. Jake endeavored to serve as that rare interlocutor, someone who listened without imposing solutions or agendas, who allowed Nick to feel acknowledged rather than orchestrated. He therefore rejects sharply any suggestion that he was aloof or indifferent. Far from withdrawing, he positioned himself close enough to confront what others preferred to overlook. It is that very attachment, he argues, that now obliges him to break the silence, even if doing so unsettles the family. Protecting Nick in his mind demands acknowledging the unvarnished facts of the situation. Throughout the turmoil, Jake's response to his brother's entreaties remained consistent. Yes, he would help. He made no claim to being a resolver of problems, yet he answered every call, late-night pleas, abrupt needs, episodes of bewilderment, without first demanding justifications. Those close to him say he placed greater value on reliable presence than on imposed order. Whether Nick required transport, a temporary refuge, or simply quiet company, Jake provided it without hesitation, convinced that steadfast availability could offer what regimens and protocols often could not. A reminder that Nick was neither isolated nor expendable. He acknowledges the occasional conflict between supporting his brother and honoring the limits Rob sought to impose. When a choice became unavoidable, however, Jake aligned with Nick, not to subvert authority, but because he regarded trust as perilously delicate, once fractured, nearly irreparable. He refrained from sermons or exhortations to pull himself together. Nick had heard those admonitions often enough. Instead, Jake concentrated on bearing witness, steadying exchanges, and de-escalating when tensions peaked. Help to him signified reliability amid chaos, not domination. In retrospect, what wounds him most is the conviction that his efforts as a brother were perpetually countervailed by an impervious barrier of reticence and supervision. Love, he concludes, proves insufficient when honesty is systematically sidelined. There arrived a juncture, Jake reflects, when professed optimism no longer rang true. Despite repeated resets, new regimens, and fresh commitments to change, Nick recurrently relapsed into familiar patterns. Initial promise, quieter periods, more lucid interactions, invariably eroded. After so many cycles, the recurrence became impossible to dismiss. The true toll, he says, was not merely the relapses themselves, but the cumulative weariness they inflicted. Nick appeared not manipulative, but depleted, exasperated by his own entrapment. Jake likens it to watching someone charge repeatedly at an unyielding barrier, each time convinced this assault might finally succeed. The family exhausted every conceivable approach, altered settings, revised structures, renewed vows that circumstances had shifted decisively. Yet stabilization proved fleeting. Unraveling followed. Eventually, even Nick seemed to lose conviction in his own advances. Most alarming to Jake was the encroaching despair. Nick was not merely faltering, he appeared to be forfeiting belief that intervention could effect meaningful change. Exchanges grew curt. Confidence eroded. Jake sensed his brother ensnared between unattainable standards and an inscrutable horizon. At that stage, the strain within the household became intolerable. Exhaustion had overtaken everyone. The atmosphere in the household had grown thick with unspoken dread. Everyone sensed the gathering storm, yet no one dared voice the starkest reality. The family's current strategy wasn't merely ineffective, it was actively exacerbating the crisis. For Jake Reiner, That realization marked a permanent rupture in his faith that time and patience alone could heal the fractures. A profound shift was required, and the failure to make it haunts him still. He remains convinced they stood perilously close to an irreparable rupture, even as the household clung to denial. Jake recalls the precise night when everything tilted. He overheard a conversation Rob clearly never meant for him to hear. It wasn't heated or theatrical. Its quiet restraint is what chilled him. In a measured, deliberate voice, Rob outlined a course of action that appeared composed on the surface, but carried an unmistakable finality beneath. Jake froze, absorbing the details. This was no tentative proposal. It was already in motion, being carefully charted. Rob spoke of relocating Nick to a distant facility, couched in terms of structure, safety, and support. But the phrasing had shifted decisively from earlier discussions. There were no references to follow-up visits, no flexible timelines, no provision for reassessment. It sounded irrevocable, less a therapeutic intervention than a means of decisively excising the issue. What unnerved Jake most was Rob's composure. No trace of rage or desperation, just calm resolve. That steady tone signaled the matter had moved beyond debate. It was now settled. The prospect that Nick might be kept in the dark about the full scope of what awaited him left Jake physically ill. When Jake later confronted Rob, seeking straight answers, he received no outright denial, only soothing assurances. Rob reportedly maintained it was in Nick's best interest, that full disclosure would provoke refusal, and that sometimes loved ones must be steered firmly toward their own welfare. Far from reassuring Jake, those words deepened his alarm. In that exchange, he felt a critical boundary had been breached. Genuine assistance had morphed into unilateral management. Concern had hardened into domination. Jake emerged from the conversation persuaded that Nick's autonomy was about to be extinguished entirely, and once lost, reclaiming a place in the family on his own terms would prove impossible. Rob, in Jake's view, had sought discretion not out of malice, but to forestall uncomfortable scrutiny. Yet once Jake became aware of the scheme, a grim clarity settled in. Nick's window was closing rapidly, and he may already have intuited as much. Almost immediately afterward, Jake detected a subtle but unmistakable change in Nick. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, just a sharpened wariness, a heightened vigilance toward every word and gesture around him. At first, Jake attributed it to mounting stress, but soon the pointed questions began. Nick started probing with unnerving precision. What happens if I refuse? Who exactly is making these calls? Will I ever return? Those inquiries struck Jake like ice. Nick had never spoken in such guarded, cornered terms before. Jake also observed Nick tracking Rob more intently, conversations halting abruptly at Rob's approach. Nick falling silent only to revisit fragments later in private, dissecting phrasing and silences for hidden meaning. It seemed Nick was quietly verifying a suspicion already taking root. Major decisions were being finalized without his input. Most disturbing was Nick's outward restraint. No tantrums, no desperate appeals, just a steely composure and an unsettling intensity in his gaze. To Jake, that surface calm did not suggest stability. It evoked someone steeling himself against an inevitable blow. Jake attempted to offer comfort, insisting nothing irreversible could proceed without open dialogue. Yet even as the words left his mouth, his own conviction had eroded. He had registered Rob's unyielding certainty. The plan was real and advancing. He began to fear Nick had sensed it too, even absent any explicit confirmation. In that crucible, Jake felt acutely powerless. He cherished his brother and yearned to intervene, yet he now stood caught between a father intent on reasserting authority and a sibling convinced his world was about to be upended beyond repair. Whatever unfolded next, Jake understood, would stem not from disorder, but from fear, reticence, and choices made well ahead of those most impacted. Once persuaded Nick might already grasp the outline of the plan, Jake abandoned subtlety. He confronted Rob directly, arguing that any relocation executed without candor would only inflame the situation. He cautioned that layering fear atop confusion was perilous for someone already so fragile. Nick, he insisted, required openness and inclusion in the process, not to be treated as its passive object. Rob's response offered no debate, no escalation, merely reiterated calm assurance that the matter was under control and that full involvement would trigger needless pushback. That exchange crystallized it for Jake. Dialogue had ceased. What remained was management of information and sequence. He walked away knowing his intervention had altered nothing. The strategy pressed on, discreetly, methodically, without Nick's agreement. The isolation enveloping Nick struck Jake hardest. He redoubled efforts to stay near, checking in relentlessly, providing what reassurance he could muster. Yet doubt gnawed at him. Nick, meanwhile, withdrew further, posing fewer questions while observing more acutely. To Jake, that deepening quiet roared louder than any outburst. The family, he says, had bifurcated into irreconcilable trajectories. Rob advancing what he deemed essential, Nick retreating inward, persuaded an irreversible step loomed. Jake remained stranded in the divide, straining futilely to decelerate a momentum no one else wished to arrest. In retrospect, Jake views this juncture as the point of no return, not born of malice, but of fear supplanting honest exchange. And once fear assumes command, even benevolent motives can propel people toward outcomes they never envisioned. Tension within the home had attained an almost palpable density, not raucous, not disordered, simply oppressive. Exchanges felt scripted, every movement seemed scrutinized, silence itself carried weight. Jake remembers traversing the house that final night, gripped by the intuition that equilibrium was about to shatter, though no overt disruption materialized. Nick spoke little, but registered everything with abnormal acuity. No restless agitation, just focused, almost clinical attentiveness. Jake sensed Nick's mind was elsewhere, methodically piecing together fragments others had overlooked. That quiet vigilance unnerved him more profoundly than any confrontation might have. In one last bid to anchor the moment, Jake drew Nick aside privately, inquiring after his state of mind and vowing no decisive action would occur without transparency. Nick offered no rebuttal, no barrage of questions. He simply absorbed the words. That muted reception unsettled Jake far more than distress would have. It carried the unmistakable timbre of capitulation. What rendered the evening nearly unendurable was Rob's demeanor. Unflappable, methodical, eerily serene. To Jake, that poise suggested not indecision but closure, someone who had already reconciled himself to the path ahead and now awaited only the opportune instant to proceed. The stark juxtaposition, Rob's quiet certitude against Nick's wordless vigilance, rendered the atmosphere almost suffocating. Jake Reiner recalls going to bed that night with an inexplicable tightness in his chest. He could not pinpoint the source of his unease, yet he sensed the family had entered perilous territory, one marked by a complete breakdown in honest communication. In retrospect, he views that evening as the final opportunity to de-escalate the gathering crisis. Instead, each member retired carrying their private, unshared version of events. By dawn, the price of that prolonged silence had grown impossible to overlook. The following morning struck Jake as strangely unreal, as though the house itself were suspended in tense anticipation. The quiet was not tranquil, but profoundly off-kilter. Texts went without reply. Routines failed to unfold in their familiar patterns. He remembers pacing the rooms, glancing repeatedly at his phone, and sensing that something fundamental had shifted irretrievably beyond the reach of dialogue. His initial response was bewilderment rather than alarm. He replayed the previous evening's exchanges in his mind. Nick's reticence, Rob's measured composure, the heavy atmosphere that had prevailed. The pieces did not yet cohere, but they felt inescapably linked. He reached out tentatively, convincing himself a plausible explanation for the pervasive stillness must exist. As the hours dragged on without one, that hope faded. Jake likens the experience to watching events slip inexorably from grasp, direction unknown. He was not responding to a discrete incident, but to a void, the absence of replies, of clarity, of the steady authority Rob had customarily exerted. What lingers most painfully for him now is how swiftly his thoughts returned to the hushed plan he had overheard, one intended to remain discreet and conclusive. He found himself questioning whether Nick had acted from terror or whether events had accelerated beyond any chance of intervention. Those uncertainties remain unresolved. Jake makes no claim to have comprehended the full sequence that morning. What he asserts is more unsettling. He recognized immediately that the family could never recover its former shape. The rupture was not merely the product of isolated failures, but the cumulative collapse of weeks of unspoken tensions. As fragments of the truth emerged in the days that followed, one conviction settled over him and has not lifted. This tragedy did not erupt spontaneously. It stemmed from everything left unsaid while there was still time to address it. In the aftermath, Jake crossed a threshold he says cannot be retraced, permanently altering his perception of Nick. The brother he once shielded, championed, and stood beside now appears unrecognizable in fundamental ways. Close associates report that Jake no longer refers to him as brother, not in fleeting anger, but from a profound and enduring fracture he regards as irreparable. Contact has ceased entirely. No calls, no messages, no tentative outreach. Those familiar with his thinking describe the withdrawal not as retribution, but as a necessary act of self-preservation. Any encounter with Nick now compels Jake to relive the warnings he issued, the efforts he made to avert disaster, and the scenes that continue to replay in his memory. He maintains that distance alone allows him to function. When the subject of forgiveness arises, Jake's position is unwavering. Sources say he offers no equivocation, no softening of terms, no crack left ajar. In his view, Nick's actions destroyed something essential, not only within the family structure, but within Jake himself. Affection may endure in some form, but trust has been extinguished, and he sees no path to its restoration after such a breach. He rejects any framing of the events as mere confusion or unavoidable fate. Choices were made, opportunities squandered, cautions disregarded, and accountability, he insists, endures. That conviction has solidified his resolve in ways time has not eroded. For Jake, confronting that reality plainly is the sole means of retaining equilibrium. As the case proceeds through the courts and details enter the public domain, Jake has chosen silence, not from a lack of words, but because the essential truths have already been settled within himself. The past is shadowed by exchanges he wishes had taken different turns. The present is defined by a single, irreversible decision he cannot countenance. For him, the narrative rests there, not in reconciliation, but in a separation he believes will never narrow. With Nick now detained awaiting trial, Jake has drawn one boundary with absolute clarity. He will not appear in support. Not in the courtroom, not privately, not in any capacity. Sources close to the family confirm that he and Romy reached this determination jointly. Neither has attended hearings nor do they intend to. For Jake, entering that space would signify acceptance of a version of events he refuses to endorse, one that might portray Nick as bewildered, victimized by circumstance, or deserving of leniency. In his estimation, the facts stand starkly on their own. No elaboration can reverse what occurred. To sit there would feel like disloyalty, not only to his parents, but to his own prior attempts to forestall the outcome. He follows legal developments only at a remove, aware of Nick's custody and the calendar's significance, but declining to track coverage, read reports, or engage with conjecture. The proceedings are inevitable, he acknowledges, yet witnessing them firsthand holds no value for him. Distance remains his mechanism for endurance. Romy's parallel absence underscores the shared resolve. Their mutual decision to abstain from any involvement that might dilute their stance or reopen grief is, by all accounts, deliberate and firm. What renders the shift most poignant is the contrast with the past. Jake would once have been the first to stand loyally at Nick's side in any circumstance. Today, he will not even enter the same courtroom. Even now, one question persists in Jake's thoughts despite his efforts to silence it. Why did Nick act? Not the mechanics or timing, but the underlying reason. He dismisses reductive explanations that impose tidy logic on chaos. Nothing about this, he maintains, was straightforward. Associates say he has grappled repeatedly with the possibility of financial motives, inherited wealth, control of assets, what Nick might have stood to secure absent his parents. He recoils at viewing his brother through that lens, yet the question lingers persistently. When trust fractures so utterly, even improbable explanations demand consideration. Yet Jake does not believe greed alone suffices as motive. He recalls Nick's evident fear, the paranoia, the sense of being trapped. He wonders whether Nick perceived an imminent, irreversible threat to his liberty, his standing in the family, or his prospects. Whether that conviction outweighed any material gain. What torments him most is the unknowable identity of the person who made the fatal choice. Desperation, premeditation, panic laced with long simmering resentment. He doubts a satisfactory answer will ever arrive, as every hypothesis circles back to the same devastating result. Publicly, Jake declines to speculate. For Jake Reiner, that realization marked a permanent rupture in his faith that time and patience alone could heal the fractures. A profound shift was required, and the failure to make it haunts him still. He remains convinced they stood perilously close to an irreparable rupture, even as the household clung to denial. Jake Reiner grants no on-the-record interviews dissecting theories or motives, yet those closest to him confide that the question of why gnaws at him relentlessly. To comprehend the impulse behind the act, they say, would be to confront how every safeguard he and the family erected ultimately failed. That failure, more than the irreversibility of what occurred, strikes him as the deepest cruelty. A lingering void where motive hovers between raw fear and deliberate intent, offering no tidy explanation and no real solace. One detail, above all, refuses to fade from his mind, no matter how much time elapses. It is not a lurid flourish or a glaring inconsistency, but the eerie composure Nick displayed once law enforcement entered the picture. According to intimates, Jake is haunted by how quickly Nick shifted from visible dread, paranoia, a sense of being cornered, to an almost clinical detachment. No frantic denials, no bewildered collapse, just calm acceptance, as though the end had already been privately conceded. Jake turns that abrupt transition over endlessly in his thoughts. The earlier terror, the mounting suspicion, the trapped feeling, all dissolving into stillness. To him, the change defies easy logic and undermines any straightforward account of events. It suggests Nick had already crossed some internal threshold long before the rest of the world caught up. The hotel room traces linger in his mind as well. Evidence discovered there, separate from the family home, forces Jake to question the degree of forethought involved. Was this the product of calculated contingency planning, or the chaotic endpoint of a spiral no one could any longer map? Both prospects unnerve him profoundly. The pain sharpens when he recalls Nick's lifelong aversion to finality. His brother once postponed decisions, sidestepped closures, recoiled from anything irrevocable. To witness that same person exhibit such quiet resignation afterward feels, to Jake, like encountering a stranger inhabiting a familiar body. He rarely voices this aloud, but those near him understand it is the reflection that robs him of sleep. Not merely the horror of what transpired, but the chilling prospect that Nick had privately reconciled himself to it before anyone else sensed the danger. That realization, they say, leads Jake to a darker view of the truth than many wish to entertain. Not because it is sensational, but because it implies the decisive choice had already been made in silence by the time alarm bells should have rung loudest. Even now, with Nick in custody and the legal process advancing, Jake maintains that critical elements remain unexamined. Timelines that appear suspiciously neat, explanations that halt just shy of full coherence, details that resist alignment no matter how often he mentally rehearses them. He returns repeatedly to the prelude, whom Nick spoke with in those final days, what he feared was imminent, what partial information he possessed, and what he may have catastrophically misinterpreted. In Jake's estimation, Nick was navigating a distorted reality that has yet to be adequately reconstructed, and that distortion, he believes, holds more explanatory power than is generally acknowledged. He questions, too, the balance between what was explicitly stated and what was merely inferred. Did unanswered questions allow fear to fill the voids, letting assumptions metastasize unchecked? This inquiry is not an exercise in exoneration, but an attempt to trace how events accelerated beyond intervention. Jake has lost faith in reductive narratives. He has watched complex family undercurrents flattened into tabloid shorthand and cable news bullet points. For him, the truth inhabits the uneasy terrain between motive and consequence, panic and premeditation, utterance and omission. Until those interstices are confronted, he says, emotional closure remains impossible, not from any desire to excuse, but because genuine comprehension may be the sole barrier against similar patterns reemerging in another household. He draws a firm distinction. He seeks understanding, never absolution. The two are routinely conflated, he notes, yet they are not the same. Probing causation does not dilute responsibility. Fear may contour decisions, but it does not nullify them. To pretend otherwise, in his view, strips accountability from the precise instant it was most urgently required. He rejects inevitability as a retrospective consolation prize for those unwilling to examine overlooked opportunities. There were junctures, he insists, where escalation might have been arrested, conversations that could have been more candid, choices deferred, red flags heeded with greater urgency. Yet he stops short of public finger-pointing or villain casting. Instead, he speaks in broader terms, of silence, control, fear, timing, their lethal convergence in a moment of profound fragility. That is the boundary he refuses to breach, acknowledging layered causation without diluting personal agency, pursuing painful clarity without extending unearned forgiveness. In the end, Jake has arrived at an unwelcome conviction. Prolonged silence, once synonymous with patience, protection, even affection, now appears to him as the mechanism that preserved dangerous illusions far too long. That shift has turned his scrutiny inward. Close observers say he judges himself harshly, not for causing the outcome, but for occasions when he opted for restraint over insistence, trusting equilibrium would return unaided. In hindsight, he fears that restraint merely deferred confrontation without averting catastrophe. He grows impatient, too, with society's rush toward resolution. To move forward absent real reckoning, he argues, is to squander lessons purchased at catastrophic price. Speaking of failures is not reopening scars, it is preventing their erasure. Silence, he has come to believe, is how destructive cycles endure. His public demeanor has hardened accordingly, not into theatrics or raw emotion, but into deliberate precision. He selects his words with care, aware of how readily such stories are sanitized. He will not permit this one to be softened, not from malice, but from fidelity to a truth he feels was deferred for too long. If any redemptive thread emerges from the wreckage, Jake maintains, it is this. Discomfort evaded does not vanish, it expands in the shadows. Breaking the quiet, however imperfectly, is for him the only credible means of ensuring the warning signs are not again quietly disregarded until collapse is inevitable. Jake Reiner chooses not to wrap his account in the comforting illusion of resolution. Instead, he delivers it raw and unvarnished. Some injuries never mend, some bonds are shattered beyond repair, and certain choices leave permanent scars on entire families. Any attempt to soften that reality might offer temporary solace, but for him it would amount to evasion. He seeks neither pity nor to dictate public opinion about his brother. His sole aim is to break a long-imposed silence. In his view, the public has a right to grasp that the tragedy did not erupt without warning or context. It was the culmination of prolonged anxiety, extended patterns of denial, and an environment of concealment that permitted underlying issues to fester unchecked. Reiner is not calling for allegiances or factionalism. He is urging recognition of the recurring signals and systemic failures that allowed events to reach this point. For him, speaking out serves three intertwined purposes: paying tribute to his parents' memory, safeguarding the unvarnished facts, and ensuring that future red flags are not dismissed simply because confronting them proves painful. He accepts that his perspective will meet disagreement, even resistance. That outcome no longer troubles him. What counts is that the narrative has at last emerged from someone who made repeated efforts to intervene before it was too late. The rest is now in the hands of those who hear it. If these details have prompted reflection, a moment of doubt about prior assumptions, or a reconsideration of what seemed settled, then the telling has done its work. See you the next video. Bye-bye.